Mid-air collision. A small plane and a tourist helicopter collide in a deadly accident over New York's Hudson River. What went wrong? Historic day.
I, Sonia Sotomayor, do solemnly swear.
Sonia Sotomayor becomes America's newest Supreme Court justice, a first on many fronts. End of the road. Tonight, after you get the cash, where old clunkers go to die. And Abbey Road, why fans are once again pouring into one of the world's most famous streets.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. We begin with a horrible air disaster here in New York City today. A sightseeing helicopter carrying a group of Italian tourists collided in midair with a small single-engine private plane. Tonight, a total of 9 people are feared dead. The aircraft collided in perfectly clear skies along the west side of Manhattan above the Hudson River. Stunned onlookers on both sides of the river watched as the aircraft fell to the water and hurled debris onto the New Jersey waterfront. We have 2 reports tonight on the collision and the many safety questions it is sure to prompt. Let's start with NBC's Jeff Rawson here in Manhattan now with the latest. Jeff?
Lester, good evening to you. Here's what we know at this hour, and this story is still developing into the evening. The helicopter took off around noon today from here at the heliport on the west side of Manhattan. Just seconds after takeoff, authorities say it collided with that small plane over the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York City. Witnesses say they heard a big boom. Tonight, police divers are in the water searching for bodies. The mid-air collision was so violent, both the airplane and the helicopter aren't even visible anymore. Now at the bottom of the Hudson River, 9 people total, all killed.
I just saw the puff of smoke and the blades fly off.
It went right in, and there was a splash, and it was completely submerged, just like that, and there was nothing else.
Aboard the sightseeing helicopter, 5 Italian tourists plus the pilot. On the airplane, this single-engine Piper, there were 3 people, including a child. Police boats rushed to the scene and recovered 3 bodies. The rest remain trapped in the wreckage underwater.
This has changed from a rescue to a recovery mission, and that probably was what we could have started out with the instant it happened.
On this clear and sunny day, the airplane took off from New Jersey's Teterboro Airport and flew south toward New York City. Moments later, the sightseeing helicopter took off from the west side of Manhattan. Officials say the plane hit the backside of the chopper, and from there, disaster.
But then we saw the rescue boats, rescue helicopters just went after like a minute. It was that quick.
A group of tourists on a nearby boat snapped these photos in the chaotic moments after the crash. A police helicopter dropped life preservers into the water, hoping to save survivors. There weren't any. This woman had tickets for that same helicopter tour and just missed that tragic flight.
Thanks to God, I think, because it's important, because we have a new chance in this life.
This is the second crash on the Hudson this year. In January, the miracle of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, where all 155 people on board survived. Today, there would be no miracle.
This is not going to have a happy ending like when the Airbus went down on the river where everybody survived. In this case, we believe that nobody has.
An NTSB GO team has just arrived on the scene tonight trying to figure out exactly what happened here. We should mention there are cameras up and down the Hudson River. So, Lester, they're hoping this accident was caught on tape.
Jeff, in a moment, we're going to hear more about that busy stretch of airway there, but you are a private pilot. In general, are there rules of the road as to who has to avoid who?
There are, actually. In fact, it works a lot like if you're driving on the road, Lester. You have to stay on the right, especially in this corridor of the Hudson River, and you're going southbound. You stay on the right, you pass other planes on the right, and in this case, it's important to note a plane almost always has the right of way over a helicopter, mainly, Lester, because a helicopter has more maneuverability. It can stop on a dime, it can hover, it can drop faster than an airplane can.
Jeff Rawson in New York City. Jeff, thank you. And as promised, today's accident brings up a host of questions about the safety of the crowded skies above New York and other major cities. NBC's Ron Allen explains.
It's probably one of the most breathtaking sightseeing trips in the world, flying along the Hudson River gazing at the skyline of New York. However, today's crash reignites a long simmering debate here about whether that narrow and crowded corridor is safe.
That's up to the FAA to determine. It may be one of those things that no amount of restriction other than preventing aircraft from coming into the area could have prevented, and that's not something that anybody wants either.
There have been other accidents along the two narrow rivers on either side of New York. One of the most recent in 2006, when New York Yankees pitcher Corey Lytle crashed with an instructor into a high-rise building.
It has become fairly clear that the airspace over the most densely populated city on Earth has become something akin to the Wild West.
Along the section of the Hudson where today's crash happened, current rules allow aircraft to fly below 1,100 feet unmonitored by air traffic controllers. Tour helicopters are supposed to maintain a specific fixed route. Even before today, it has been an industry under a lot of scrutiny.
The question has always been raised, is there enough oversight by the FAA? And are these folks regulated enough to ensure the highest levels of safety?
It's estimated some 2 million people fly some kind of air tour each year, paying between $30 and a few $100s. There have been crashes at national monuments like the Grand Canyon, where this helicopter accident killed 7. There have been more than 50 air tour-related deaths there since 1991. The issue is especially sensitive in states like Hawaii, with one of the largest air tour industries. Federal authorities recently imposed tougher rules on pilots after finding pilot decision-making about weather conditions to be the cause of 2 recent fatal crashes. At this point, the cause of the New York accident is unclear, but it will certainly force authorities to take a closer look at planes and helicopters in crowded skies. Ron Allen, NBC News, New York.
Turning now to the history that was made today in Washington, D.C. America has a new Supreme Court justice tonight. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was sworn in at the court this morning, and the ceremony made history in more ways than one. NBC's justice correspondent Pete Williams joins us from the Supreme Court tonight. Pete, good evening.
Lester, good evening. There's never been anything quite like what we saw here today. How it happened, where it took place, how it was covered, even when on a Saturday. This was a day of firsts.
Good morning and welcome to the court.
Nearly everything about this ceremony made history. As her mother Selena held the Bible and her brother Juan stood by, Chief Justice John Roberts led her through the oath.
I, Sonia Sotomayor, do solemnly swear.
Formally making her the nation's first Hispanic Supreme Court justice.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations and welcome to the court.
Friends and family members applauded, and she hugged her mother, who raised her as a single parent after her father died when she was 9. Where she was sworn in today was symbolic too, a formal conference room at the Supreme Court. And for the first time, cameras were allowed in to record the event. Just before, in a private ceremony, Roberts led her through another oath. Federal law requires a special one for judges. Today's event was a big change from past swearing-in ceremonies for Supreme Court justices held at the White House.
I, Samuel A. Alito.
I, John G. Roberts.
I, Clarence Thomas. Do solemnly
Though swearing-in justices at the White House has been going on for nearly 70 years, members of the court have become more vocal in complaining that it sends the wrong signal.
They figure that if the picture that goes out is of them being sworn in at the White House, it somehow conveys the idea that they're beholden to the president, they owe him a favor, and that there's some kind of a political trophy.
So help me God.
And whose idea was it to break with 7 decades of tradition?
I have decided to nominate an inspiring woman who I believe will make a great justice.
White House and Supreme Court officials all say it was President Obama's desire to have Sonia Sotomayor swearing in at the Supreme Court and on camera.
The president, somebody who studied the Supreme Court, believes it's simply best for independents to have the new justice sworn in where she'll do her work independent of any interference from the executive or the legislative branch.
To emphasize his point about independence, President Obama even stayed away from today's ceremony. The president will host her at a White House reception on Wednesday. Sonia Sotomayor is now a Supreme Court justice 74 days after she was nominated. And that's one thing about today that did not make history. That length of time is about average, Lester.
All right, NBC's Pete Williams at the Supreme Court. Thanks. Meanwhile, from coast to coast today, there have been celebrations over this latest barrier that's been broken. NBC's George Lewis on those who were thrilled to be living history.
I, Sonia Sotomayor, do
From the Bronx in New York
As Associate Justice of the Supreme Court,
to a restaurant in East Harlem where some women wore Wise Latina T-shirts,
as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court,
to the campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills, south of Los Angeles. They watched,
congratulations and
applauded, and cheered.
It is fabulous. It is great for the United States. It's great for the Latino community. It's great for the Puerto Rican community.
Among those watching today's swearing-in, Alejandra Velazquez, who says this historic moment sends a powerful message to Latinos.
You have a role model, and that if you work hard, if you're dedicated, that it's doable.
She says, in many ways, Sotomayor's story is her story. Sotomayor came from the housing projects in the Bronx. Velazquez came from here, East Los Angeles, both women raised in poverty by single mothers. Through hard work, Sotomayor made it through Princeton and then Yale Law School. Velazquez went to Yale on a scholarship and is now a second-year law student at UCLA. Si se puede?
Sí se puede.
Translation, yes, we can. And now that Sonia Sotomayor is officially on the U.S. Supreme Court, what would Alejandra Velazquez like people to remember about this day?
That there is hope and chance that you can make your dreams come true. And keeps me want to keep fighting.
George Lewis, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Now to the White House and the fever pitch of a health care debate. Some town halls are becoming town brawls. And now a new warning from former governor and vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin is turning the heat up even more. NBC's Mike Vicara is at the White House. Mike, good evening to you.
Good evening, Lester. Those raucous town hall protests continue this weekend, and now the president is hitting back on what he calls the misleading information that inspires them.
50 million people who don't have a health insurance plan.
Today, more confrontation at town halls across the country.
The Medicare program.
As members of Congress try to talk health care with voters back home. In many cases, only to be shouted down by opponents of the Democratic plans to change the system. And now a familiar voice is raising the temperature. Sarah Palin, just 2 weeks removed from office, writes on her Facebook page, "My parents or my baby with Down syndrome will have to stand in front of Obama's death panel so his bureaucrats can decide whether they are worthy of health care. Such a system is downright evil." Today, in his weekly address, the president spoke out against false assertions about the plan, calling it misleading information.
And let me start by dispelling the outlandish rumors that reform will promote euthanasia or cut Medicaid or bring about a government takeover of health care. That's simply not true.
Representative John Dingell was shouted down at a town hall in Michigan.
One of the unfortunate and important evil consequences of some of the events that are happening now is that people are being denied the opportunity to communicate with their representatives.
Dingell and others say the protests are incited by conservative fringe elements and cite internet flyers like this one, advising protesters yell back and have someone else follow up with a shout-out. But opponents of the plan say the anger is genuine.
Freedom is what the United States is about!
I think what we're just seeing is that the energy is on the side of not wanting a giant government encroachment into health care.
And though for now backers of reform are being outshouted, the question is, will they be outvoted when Congress returns in the fall?
This just raises their collective blood pressure significantly, makes them more nervous about casting a tough vote.
And Lester, the president plans to continue to talk about both his health care plan and the economy this week when he makes a trip to New Hampshire for yet another town hall. Lester.
NBC's Mike Vicara, thank you. A quick program note, healthcare and the economy are on the agenda for tomorrow morning's Meet the Press broadcast. Among David Gregory's guests, 2 big city mayors, including Michael Bloomberg, who we saw in our top story tonight. That's tomorrow morning on NBC. Still ahead as nightly news continues, cash for clunkers. We know where the cash goes. Tonight we'll show you what happens to the clunkers. And later, why so many are returning to the road the Beatles put on the map.